Welcome to this training webinar about the role of the nominee in early years. You may well be watching this webinar to decide if you need a nominee or not on inspection. The information in this webinar is aimed to help you feel better informed about the inspection process and to know whether a nominee may be appropriate for your setting or not. Please find the main aims of this session listed on the screen. The renewed inspection framework is intended to achieve greater levels of collaboration, increase transparency of inspection, and strengthen inspection dialogue. Therefore, we'll be inviting leaders and, where there is one, the nominee, to work with us more closely throughout the inspection. Ofsted's ambition is to reset our relationship with those we regulate and inspect, working collaboratively with them to put children first. Here is a visual plan of the session, and we'll break this into 4 distinct parts. Let's start with the role of the nominee. It's important to start this session by making very clear that the nominee is distinct from the role of the nominated individual appointed by the registered provider and therefore does not replace this. It's important that we don't confuse the two. Nominated individuals oversee the management of the provision and are the point of contact for Ofsted in relation to the registration. While the role of the nominee, as set out in the early years inspection information supporting guidance, is to support with communication, coordination and collaboration throughout the inspection. Settings are invited to nominate a member of staff to be the nominee. However, there is no expectation that settings provide one, and therefore settings will not be at any disadvantage if they don't have one. This is because the nominee is a role that may not always be relevant for every inspection or for every setting. We would therefore encourage leaders to make the decision about whether a nominee is needed or not based on their context, their setting staffing, and specific needs. For childminders or smaller group-based settings, there is no nominee. However, in rare cases, such as in larger group-based settings or where there is more than one inspector, leaders might want to nominate someone to be the nominee if this is practical to do so to help the inspection to run smoothly. Where a nominee is identified, they should have a thorough knowledge of how the setting operates on a day-to-day basis. Where in a provision they have a member of staff who is also an Ofsted inspector, they can take on this role if selected by the leader. However, please do remember that the role of nominee in inspection is not compulsory. In most settings, including childminder settings, a nominee will not be required because the childminder or leader will liaise directly with the inspector throughout the inspection. It's important to say again that settings will not be disadvantaged by not having a person taking on the specific role of nominee. Now let's move on to the responsibilities of the nominee in a bit more detail. Let's have a think about what the key responsibilities of the nominee might be. Take some time to think about this in terms of how the nominee might support the communication, coordination, collaboration, and practicalities before, during, and after the on-site inspection. You may have considered these aspects for responsibilities prior to the on-site inspection. This isn't an exhaustive list. Bear in mind that these are suggested responsibilities and might well vary depending on the provision structure and availability. Following notification, you, as the nominee, can choose to attend the planning call. This is an opportunity to get to know the inspector and clarify any questions you or other leaders have about the inspection. It's an opportunity to flag any sensitivities, reasonable adjustments required, and to help inspectors understand the context of the provision so that they can best arrange the inspection timetable and approach. It's an opportunity to, where applicable, find out who is on the inspection team if there is more than one inspector, and check for any conflicts of interest. Through the planning stages, the nominee can also help to communicate the inspection timetable and logistics to staff and other leaders ahead of inspection. Ahead of inspection, it's useful for the nominee to ensure any immediate questions that leaders or staff have about the process are answered. This can help alleviate any anxiousness ahead of the main inspection event. Moving on to during the inspection. Here again are some suggestions. At the start of the inspection, nominees can bring any new points of note to the inspector that may have arisen since the previous day's planning. Nominees will join the inspector for inspection activities where appropriate. This serves two main purposes. Firstly, to increase transparency about how the inspection process works, and secondly, enables the nominee to see and hear exactly what inspectors do. This can aid the dialogue as evidence emerges through the inspection. However, it is important to note that in early years settings, having too many adults in a small space with young children may impact on not only the amount of space available for children to play and to be comfortable, but also on inspectors being able to observe typical practice. Therefore, inspectors and nominees will need to be flexible and discuss when it is appropriate for the nominee to be involved in this way. Where, for example, there is more than one inspector, the nominee may complete inspection activities deemed appropriate to gain an ongoing view as to how the inspection evidence is emerging and ensure this is communicated back to leaders and staff where appropriate. In some cases, their role might also involve coordinating the final feedback arrangements at the end of the inspection. For example, in larger settings, this might include liaising with the inspector and leader as to who is best to attend the final feedback meeting, and then agree final attendance with the inspector. Taking high-level notes of feedback is encouraged so that the benefits of any inspection feedback can be used to help leaders reflect and continue to improve their provision after the inspection is over. The role might also include keeping oversight on any planned reasonable adjustments, arrangements, or adaptations to check that they're working as expected. Keeping an ongoing check-in on staff and leaders' well-being is something both nominee and the inspector will regularly review. And finally, here are some suggested responsibilities after the on-site inspection. With leaders, check through the accuracy of the inspection report, and help complete the post-inspection survey, which helps us to review how well the inspection was conducted. There are a few limitations with the role of nominee which are set out in the inspection information guidance. For example, the nominee will not have access to safeguarding complaints or any whistleblowing information and will not be present during confidential discussions with children, staff or parents, or where their presence could limit open dialogue. Now moving on to the renewed inspection framework. The renewed inspection framework builds on the strengths of the Education Inspection Framework principles and looks to enhance our ways of working, continuing to put children first in the process. The renewed inspection framework and supporting guidance are published, and as a nominee, it will be helpful for you to have sight of these. So, now we're going to spend a few minutes considering some inspection scenarios and how we might respond to them. We can never predict every circumstance that might happen on an inspection, so these are just some examples to get us thinking.
There are 4 scenarios altogether. We'll consider each one in turn. I'll introduce each scenario, and I suggest you pause the recording to think about your response before moving on.
So let's look at scenario 1. The nominated individual has arranged to have a conversation with the inspector at a specific time, but they've contacted you to say that they're significantly delayed by a road closure and they're unlikely to make it by the time agreed. They're concerned that they won't be able to speak with the inspector and therefore this will look bad for the set-in. What would you do in that scenario? Sometimes these things happen. And this scenario, you might want to have discussed with the inspector the options and alternatives that could be considered, which could be rearranging the conversation by phone, or maybe having it later in the day, if this is practically possible, and reassuring the nominated individual that they will not be at a disadvantage if they're not able to speak to the inspector. The best solution is to work through the alternatives that work best for all involved. And while it may not be the first preferred option, we can work around these circumstances to ensure that the same information and evidence can be sought through other means. Now let's look at another scenario. A member of staff tells you, as the nominee, that they are really anxious. and they state that they don't want to be observed or spoken to by the inspector as part of the inspection. What might you do faced with this situation? In this scenario, you would of course follow the process that you would normally do in providing care for staff. You might want to find out what their specific concerns are and provide reassurance about how inspection works, reiterating that inspectors don't observe or feedback on individual practice. You might want to offer for them to go to discussions with another colleague for support and let the inspector know. And if you're concerned about their level of anxiety, you will need to raise this in the planning call with the inspector so that you can discuss the best way forward. Some level of anxiety can be normal, particularly if someone hasn't been involved in inspection before. However, we would never want anyone's well-being to be detrimentally affected by the process. It's important that you feed this directly into the inspection. If the inspector is made aware early on through the planning stages of inspection, they can ensure that additional levels of sensitivity can be applied where levels of anxiety might be high. We would encourage anyone due to have a discussion with an inspector on a one-to-one basis to take along a colleague if they're feeling nervous. This can help reassure them, but also help them reflect on the discussion with someone afterwards, so they're clear about any follow-up points that may need pursuing. Let's move on to scenario 3 and think about what you might do if faced with this situation. A staff member approaches you after having a discussion with the inspector, and they're concerned that they might not have conveyed the information that they'd wanted to clearly enough. What would you do? In this scenario, you might want to ask the member of staff what points they felt they were unable to get across, and inform the inspector of the discussion and the member of staff's concerns. You might want to discuss with the inspector the best way to approach this so that key points from staff can be captured, and provide feedback to the member of staff on the action that you and the inspector have taken. We wouldn't want any member of staff feeling they hadn't had their say, so it's important to raise any concerns, like the one outlined in this scenario, with the inspector so that a solution can be found quickly. Let's move on to the final scenario. Through the reflective discussions with the inspector, the grading of achievement is emerging as expected standard. This contrasts with the setting's own evaluation of this area of strong standard. You are clear as to how and why inspectors are drawing these conclusions, as you've been involved firsthand in the inspection activities. However, other leaders are not in agreement with this emerging picture. What would you do in this situation? On occasions, in larger settings, there may be times when leaders are less directly involved in the inspection process. Leaders may not have seen and heard all of the emerging findings. The nominee can potentially help to make sure that leaders are kept up to date of emerging findings, such as activities that have been completed jointly, and help decide what other inspection activities the inspector could explore to help the inspector make best use of the remaining time regarding the inspection timetable and priorities. You've just listened to an array of information about what you as the nominee need to know about the role of the nominee. So we're going to do a quick refresher. I want you to consider if this statement is true or false. The role of nominee on inspection is compulsory. The answer is false, and that's because the role of nominee is optional. The nominee is a role that may not always be relevant for every inspection. It may be beneficial in some larger, more complex settings to have someone as well as the leader who knows the setting's day-to-day operations well to support planning, communication and engagement throughout the inspection. Again, consider if this statement is true or false. The nominee's role can extend before, during and after the on-site inspection. And this statement is true, and that's because the nominee's role can start from the point of planning before the on-site inspection, throughout the inspection itself. And it can also involve checking the accuracy of the inspection report with leaders once it's made available for review, and helping to complete the post-inspection survey. Let's now consider if this statement is true or false. Anyone in a setting can hold the role of nominee. The answer in this case is false, and that's because the nominee should have sufficient knowledge of the setting's operational day-to-day business, and also be a senior member of staff and have a whole provision role or responsibility. And now let's move on to the final statement. Is this one true or false? A member of staff who is an Ofsted inspector can take on the role of nominee. This statement is true. If a member of staff is also an Ofsted inspector, they can take on the role of nominee. And let's finish with some key reminders of the role of nominees in early year settings. The role of nominee is distinct from the role of the nominated individual, and therefore does not replace this. For childminders, or smaller group-based settings, there is no need for a nominee. However, for larger, more complex group-based settings, leaders may wish to nominate someone to be the nominee for the inspection. The role of nominee is not compulsory, and settings will not be at any disadvantage if they do not nominate someone. Many thanks for listening.